Well, welcome to the third in this series on how things exist, which is the title of Lama Zopa's book. And the subtitle is Teachings on Emptiness. And that's what I'm emphasizing here. For tonight's class, I want to start again with a quotation from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And this is from the book Stages of Meditation, which I quoted from previously. His Holiness is commenting on a text by Kamala Shila, a very important early teacher of Buddhism in Tibet. He says, even among Buddhist schools of thought, the interpretation of the meaning of emptiness differs. The interpretation of the Chittamatra school is not acceptable to those who propound the Madhyamika philosophy. Likewise, the proponents of the Chittamatra school, too, have their own logic to refute the Madhyamika viewpoint. We need to develop, and here's the important point, we need to develop a broad perspective enabling us to see the wholeness of the Buddhist philosophy rather than its fragments. The wholeness of the philosophy rather than its fragments. And to me, that means, in a certain way, understanding all the different schools of Buddhism. Now, in the Gaelic tradition that His Holiness and Lama Zopa exemplify, the way this tends to be understood is you learn about the so-called lower schools of philosophy and their views, and then you learn about the higher schools, which refute what are considered some either errors or limitations, depending upon how you want to look at it, in the lower schools. And you work your way up till you get to Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is the school of the Dalai Lamas, Tsongkhapa, and a specific interpretation of Chandakirti, and Chandakirti interpreting Nagarjuna, and Nagarjuna explaining Shakyamuni Buddha. And so that's kind of the way it is in Buddhist history. And I mean, we know Buddhist history is over 2,500 years old. And so there have been many, many ways of understanding some fundamental concepts. Now, what I've been trying to move toward or emphasize or focus on in this particular series of lectures is thinking about emptiness from the point of view of our own practice. Now, traditionally, the Tibetan Buddhists would say that first you study the philosophy, you understand the theory or the doctrines, and then you think about them. In monasteries, you would debate them, but you contemplate, you reflect on the meaning of the things you've been studying so that you get a firm grasp of those things. And then in meditation, you really focus on those particular issues. And if you're very accomplished, you focus on it one-pointedly, that would be shamatha. And if you're like the rest of us, your mind wanders around and you drag your mind back to the subject of your meditation, and you just do that over and over again. Because we don't really have the training to have our minds very seriously focused. We don't know how to do it. We haven't been taught how to do it. So we do the best we can. And there's value in that. I mean, there's value in having a distracted meditation on these topics. I mean, you can learn things and you can experience things and you can change in ways that would be more profound if you could have one-pointed meditation. But since that's not really something that most of us can achieve, that doesn't mean we have to give up. There's still there are many outcomes that are positive. And there are things that we experience in the post-meditative session that are influenced by the meditative session. We can be different. We can learn things in the meditative session that cause us to see things differently, to react differently. So it's possible when you're reading the Buddhist texts which are mostly written for monks and nuns who are professional practitioners, if you will, of this material. We learn these sort of lofty approaches, these lofty views, and then when we try to do these things, it's kind of like, yikes, that's not working for me too well. And it's easy to get frustrated, but I think it's important not to give up. So in my own case, and I'll be speaking from my own experience this evening, in my own case, it's very hard for me to concentrate my mind. I have a wandering mind. I've never been able to focus it and nail it down really well. I've never really learned how to concentrate. And I suppose I could have, if when I was younger, I sat down and done a shamatha retreat of 3 years. Maybe I could have come out of that and had a very focused mind, but I'm a very worldly person. I've always worked. I've always wanted to be married. I've always lived in the world. And yet at the same time, I've always felt that only living in the world was not enough, that there had to be something deeper, that these two had to be connected in some way, and that they somehow I always felt they had to enrich each other. I felt that my worldly life could enrich my practice, and I certainly believed that my practice would enrich my worldly life, that it would go both ways. I'm not entirely sure that the monastic tradition would agree with me about that it goes both ways. I don't actually know. But one way or the other, that's what my own life and practice has been. And I think that for most of us, that's the way it is. And so that's what I want to share, how I've been able to practice with the philosophy of emptiness for almost 40 years now. And maybe I've had a little experience and maybe I've learned a little. And so I'll try and share that. So back to this idea about the different schools of Buddhism, which Tibetans see as being of greater and greater sophistication, starting with the lower schools and working their way up to the higher schools. But I've found that all the schools that I've been able to understand present something very useful for my own practice, and I think useful for anybody's practice. And so that's where I'm going to jump off. And I'm going to begin with this observation that all of our experience, whether it's our experience of ordinary life or our experience of sitting on the meditation cushion and trying to accomplish something, or I guess if we were Zen practitioners, try to not accomplish something, but that's a different way of thinking about things that I'll set aside for the moment, or set aside permanently, actually, for this series of lectures. I don't want to go there. I just distracted myself to the point where I may have lost track of what I'm doing. Okay, so let me see if I can resuscitate my train of thought here, or whether it's so underwater that I can't. Anyway, so all of our experience, basically, and we understand this, is divided into the experience of subject and object. We go through our lives and we see ourselves as a subject of experience. There's me in here, or at least there's in here, and then there's out there. And there's some kind of relationship that's going on between these two things. And that's the place where I want to begin. I want to begin with what is considered a lower school of thought, which is Hinayana school of thought. And I find that even in the practice of basic meditation, as I'm sitting down and I'm dealing with the fact that I've sort of extracted myself from the ordinariness of what's going on in my day, which in my case means an unfortunate habit of reading newspapers when I'm drinking tea in the morning and then sitting down to meditate, or making breakfast and then sitting down to meditate. So my mind is already distracted. I find it's very helpful to think about what are the basics of my experience, for starters, and look at the empty nature of those basic features of my experience, for starters. So what does that mean? Well, what's basic to my experience are what the Buddhists call the five skandhas, or the five aggregates. So we know all about this. This is the way the body-mind is divided up into perception and mental activity and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here. But when my thoughts occur to me, or when I think about the physical environment in which I exist or something like that, and I think about the empty nature of those thoughts, or I think about the empty nature of that physical environment, of course, I go through very rapidly the three reasons why things are empty, that they're made up, everything is made up of parts. It's dependent upon causes and conditions, whatever it is that I'm experiencing. And it's known to be what it is to me because of my mental labeling process. Okay. So for example, I'm sitting in a house and it occurs to me that the house is built by somebody and so on and so forth. That's all simple and practical. But on a subtler level, the reason that I'm in the house is because of the flow of all the experiences of my life that have brought me to this place in this moment. That every single thing that's happened over 76 years has somehow contributed to my sitting on this meditation cushion at this day, now having this experience in this house. Everything. It's all wrapped up in this space. So, I mean, that's in one way, that's very positive. I mean, it's kind of like, wow, here's the sum total of my life, right? But in another way, it suggests the transitoriness of things, because this isn't, I've been fortunate, this isn't the only house I've owned. So there's been a whole sequence of houses in the past that's generated this house in the present. So what that means to me, when I think about this, is that this may not be the only house that I live in. It's probably the only, I'm probably not going to own another house, but that doesn't mean I won't live someplace else. At my age, it could mean, you know, I'm living in a nursing home. That'll be my next quote, home or house. And so all these things appear. And I think it's important to recognize where we are in the flow of these things. The other thing that I find interesting about the emptiness teaching within the context of the lower schools, the Hinayana schools, is that they focus primarily on the way in which the self that appears in the body-mind complex, or the five skandhas, really is a designation, is an idea, is a concept, which is then imputed or imputed on or projected on to the five skandhas, onto the body-mind complex. And again, you know about all this. I don't need to go into great detail about it. But the way it occurs to me when I'm sort of in the meditative situation is that there are things going on around me that involve other people. I meditate in the living room because we have a small house. And my wife will come through because she's making some tea for breakfast, or she needs to make some breakfast herself, or put some food out for our cat. So there's an interaction that I'm having in that situation with another person. I'm not talking with her, but we are having an interaction. So if I think about this other person, yeah, okay, I can think about K as a label designated on the body-mind complex of this entity that just walked through the room. But what's more interesting is, why is she walking through the room? What's going on in that process of her moving through the room? Which is actually quite similar to what's going on in the process of my sitting still on a meditation cushion with my hands folded in my lap, breathing quietly and trying not to move, even if I itch and my legs are going to sleep and whatnot. What's happening is she's enacting habit patterns. That's where all that movement is about. I mean, she slept a certain amount in the evening and she woke up at a certain time because of the complex series of causes and conditions that came together and some habits that she has. And then she washed up or didn't wash up and came out here. And in all of her movements, what's being enacted is the habit patterns that have come together at that particular moment in time. And I find it very interesting to watch this because, of course, that's also what's going on for me on the meditation cushion. I mean, why am I sitting here and meditating? It's the sum total of the habits of my life that I'm interested in doing such a thing. When my brother gets up in the morning, he makes a cup of coffee, sits down, eats a croissant, and I don't know what else he does. But I know one thing he certainly doesn't do is he doesn't sit down to meditate because that's not something that ever interested him. Okay. So the very fact that I'm even sitting there is the sum total of all the habits of my life and manifesting in that particular moment. So why do I even want to think about such a thing? Well, there's a good reason from my point of view. In the post-meditative session, like what goes on when I get off the meditation cushion, if I've been contemplating that reality as part of my meditative process, then whenever I'm seeing people walking around doing whatever they're doing, driving their cars, walking their dogs, going to work, being at work, going to the grocery store, whatever the case may be, if I can remember what I was noticing when I was sitting in the meditative situation, what I notice is a body mind that's being driven by habit patterns. Now, I can't do this all the time. I basically have to stop and think, what do I think is really going on here? Versus just sort of like a robot going through the process of doing the grocery shopping, for example. Here's the list. Okay, get 2 bottles of orange juice, get some yogurt, and so on and so forth. And I'm not paying attention to a lot of stuff. But if I stop and sort of draw inward, I can look at what's going on around me. And not just what's going on within me, but what's going on around me. And what do I see? What I see is the 5 skandha concatenations being driven by the unfolding habit patterns of all of those individuals. Why is that useful? I find it useful because if something is going on which would otherwise irritate me, like I'm pissed off at somebody for something that's going on in the grocery store, which happens often enough, during the COVID, it would be sort of like, hey, there's 40 people in this grocery store, 39 of them are wearing a mask and you're not. Why is that? Why are you endangering me? And I'd get angry, you know? And then I could back off and think, well, what's going on here? I mean, setting aside my reaction, what's going on here? You know, what's going on here is a sum total of a bunch of habit patterns that's labeled that person over there. That deconstructs the person and it changes the whole nature of my emotional reaction to them. That's not hard to do if you practice it. It's a little hard to do to practice in the grocery store unless you've been practicing it on the meditation cushion. Okay. So what I'm saying is there is some value to seeing the empty nature of people as expressed in the Hinayana schools so that you can be familiar with that on the meditation cushion. And then post-meditation, it's a lot easier to go back into that frame of reference and change the way you are in relationship to the people around you. And that certainly is useful. And I'm not even talking about compassion bodhicitta here. I'm just talking about, you know, the real simpleness or simple aspect of human beings getting along with each other as they move through life, you know, and not being reactive. Okay. So that's not a really complicated thing to think about or complicated thing to do. In the passage that I was just quoting, His Holiness talks about the Chittamatra school of thought. And he does that because in this particular book by Kamala Shila, this way of thinking is expressed quite frequently. One of the things that we read about in one of the other books that I've been teaching about in this series is that the way that Chittamatras viewed emptiness was they viewed it as the non-differentiability, perhaps I would say, between subject and object. That fundamentally they are, I don't think that they would say that they're one, but they would say that there's not a fundamental difference between subject and object, which could be interpreted as everything you experience is only your own mind. And I think that that's a fair interpretation. If you really consider what your experiences are, and we're all modern people, so we know something about the way the mind works, so we know how the sense organs work, and so on and so forth, we realize that most of what we just take to be objective reality is a mental construct in our consciousness of something that's out there. And we've created this mental image of what's out there. And when I say mental image, I don't just mean what we see, but also what we hear, what we smell. Excuse me. All of this stuff is put together by our mental consciousness. And we create this internal movie, if you will, that represents what's going on externally. And this is what the Chittamatrans are talking about by my simplistic interpretation. When they're talking about the non-difference between subject and object, which is to say, I look at this computer monitor and I think of it natively as something that's out there, but realistically speaking, what it is something I'm seeing. And it's something that's an image in my own mind. Now, you could get solipsistic about this and think, okay, that means there's no world, it's only in my own mind. And then some Buddhists have fallen into that, right? But that's not what it really means. What it really means is that there's something out there, but we don't know it directly. Why is it useful then to think about the fact on the meditation cushion? Why is it useful to think about the fact that, or contemplate the fact, or notice the fact, depending upon what you're doing when you're sitting, that everything you're experiencing is really your own mind, right? Why is that at all useful? Because if it's your own mind and created by your own mind can change it within limits, right? I mean, I painted the walls of this room blue, so okay, blue walls are in my own mind. I can't sit on the meditation cushion and decide that the walls are going to be red. That's not going to work. I mean, I don't know. There are some schools of thought that believe that if I really do that, the walls will turn red. I mean, there are some magically oriented yoga schools, but generally, that doesn't seem to be the case. However, if it's in my own mind, then how I relate to it can change. If I'm bothered by it, I can change that because it's in my own mind. If I'm bothered by my wife wandering through the living room on the way to the kitchen to make some tea, I can change that because it's in my own mind, right? It doesn't change her shuffling through the living room. It changes the dynamic relationship of subject and object, of presumably my being subject and the shuffling sound being object. That can change. So that's useful because instead of being bothered by it when I'm sitting on the meditation cushion, the sound goes in and the sound goes out. Doesn't have any impact, right? Now you can push that farther if you want to. It's like, oh, my knees are bothering me. Well, okay, that's an experience. I can treat my knees as a solid object and do something about it. Or I can think, well, the pain I feel in my knees is happening in my mind. And I can contemplate its empty nature. What is the empty nature of pain? That gets kind of interesting. Okay. That becomes a very profitable way to apply the notion of emptiness to the stuff that I'm experiencing within that context, that Chittamatra context, if you will, of subject and object not being fundamentally different. Now, once again, you have to think about these things within limits. Because if I sit there and my knee is hurting me, and I sit there for 90 minutes with my knee hurting, I might not be able to walk that day. All right. So, I mean, you have to maintain your common sense in all of this sort of thing also. But a lot of options exist. And so I'm promoting the idea of thinking about things in this way. Now, where I find that it gets much more useful is in regards to the thoughts that are wandering through my mind, which I really wish would stop pestering me. But as at least some of my teachers have said, it's in the nature of the mind to think, and it's going to happen. So the idea that you're going to be able to stop the mind from thinking, now that doesn't mean that nobody can stop their mind from thinking, but that I can't stop my mind from thinking in that particular situation. If I apply this meditation on emptiness to the thoughts that occur to my mind, then my relationship with them shifts. So what's that been like for me? And presumably, what could that be like for you? Well, for one thing, if a thought pops into my mind, where did it come from? Now, usually, the meditation teachers will say, look, you just let it into your mind, notice it and let it out. It'll go away. As long as you don't get stuck on the story that the thought is going to open you to, if that made sense, right? I could think about the dog barking in the backyard, my favorite example, and I could think about the people who live in the backyard, or I'm sorry, in the house behind my backyard, and then I could think about those people who are there, and then I could think, how is it that it doesn't bother them that the dog barks for an hour, and so on and so forth, and I can go down that whole. All right, no, you don't want to do that. So the meditation teachers will say, okay, you hear the dog barking, you notice that it bothers you, you have a thought about the neighbors that irritate you, let it go. Just don't follow it, and the thought will go away. But there's an alternative. If you meditate on the empty nature of the thought, then what? Well, what does that mean to meditate on the empty nature of the thought? To notice the empty nature of the thought. That means it came from somewhere, it's made of parts, and it's designated by labeling. How do you apply that to thoughts? Wait, there's a text here. Hold on a minute. If you know you're not the mind, then what matter if the mind is overactive? I don't want to go there right now, Jeffrey. If I do that, I'll get sidetracked. I'm not saying you're wrong. I just don't want to get sidetracked. If you meditate in this way or contemplate in this way about the empty nature of the thought, one thing that you'll notice is that it's a habit pattern that's manifesting. The neighbors aren't bothered by dogs that bark, and I am. Why is that? What is it in my history that makes dogs barking bother me, or makes barking dogs bother me? So that might be interesting to investigate, because if I could get at what that is, what would happen? Maybe something would change. Well, maybe that's trivial with barking dogs, but it could be quite significant with something else. Like, for example, if I were still working, I might have some thoughts about the fact that I'm very irritated with my boss at work, which could become very problematic for me when I go into work that day. It might be very interesting for me to explore why it is that authority figures are a problem for me. Where does that come from? I might be able to see it if I look at the source of this. Or if I merely recognize that it's an unfolding habit pattern, something else might show itself to me. Right? So this is a different way to apply the notion of emptiness to thoughts. Or you could apply the notion of emptiness to the thought, and the thought will just sort of decompose and go away and leave you alone. And you'll learn something about your own mind, which is thoughts come up, and thoughts are of a certain nature, and they're transitory. They have causes and conditions. And you don't have to be ruled by them. You can see them for what they are. Okay. So there's something else. Now, I think about this again within the context of the Chittamatra school of subject and object, consciousness and thought, not being fundamentally different from each other. Okay. Now, that to me does not contradict the view of the Prasangika school, which is school Lama Zopa follows. And remember his example about labeling. He talked about you walk into a room, you see a table. That's because your label is a table. What's really there? Well, there's a base and you've labeled table on that base. Well, I don't think that that contradicts anything, really, personally, that exists in the Chittamatra framework of subject and object are not fundamentally different from each other. Right? What is the base? What is being labeled? Well, I'm labeling what that inner chatter was as a thought. There is a base. What is the base? Something moved in my mind. That was the base. What happens if I look at the thought that flies by and notice it in this way, that there is something there which I have labeled a thought, and that I have emotional and other intellectual reactions to? What happens if I search for the base, which is what's really there, and upon which I'm labeling the experience as a thought? So I can't tell you what it is that I'm going to find there, because I can only use language to do that. And language is labeling. So whatever I say about that base, that foundation that I've labeled a thought, is going to be a distortion. I'm not going to be able to tell you what it is. All I can say is that if in your own meditative experience, you hold in mind these reasons for emptiness, and with that attitude, notice what's going on in your mind, things shift very radically. Things shift very radically. Now, one thing I've noticed is that there are less thoughts, actually. I don't know why that is, but it does seem to be the case. And one thing that I've noticed is that when the thoughts occur, they're less bothersome, because they're now the subject of my meditative practice, if you will. Maybe subject is a dangerous word because we're talking about subject and object, but they're now the content of my meditative practice. They're what I'm trying to understand. So this is the power of the Prasangika point of view, which is understanding the difference between what's actually there and what appears to be there. What appears to be there is what has been labeled, and what's actually there is what's there without the label, which is a different level of reality. And we can get at it. We can sort of chip away at the appearances to get at the reality. So the Buddha counsels us that we need to live in reality. So this is what I'm talking about doing, practicing getting at a certain kind of reality. Now, the other thing that I've experienced and that I'm going to recommend to you, because the Dalai Lama recommended it to me, I mean, in one of his books, not like he was sitting down and talking. He said, now, David, you should do this, right? And this is something that was in one of his books and that has struck me, which I mentioned several times. So meditating on the mental consciousness produces the greatest progress. Okay, if you're meditating on or noticing the thoughts, that's the mental consciousness holding thoughts. But you can look at the consciousness itself, that is the subject being aware of the thought, which is the object. This is a little hard to do in the very beginning, but it's not really all that hard because it's what you experience. And we're all smart people. We can recognize that we're aware of our thoughts. And so we can look at the awareness of our thought and then be very interested in that awareness. Now, if all phenomena are devoid of inherent existence, which is to say all phenomena are empty in the ways that we've been talking about, then awareness itself and consciousness itself must be of an empty nature, of a devoid nature. This is where things get really powerful. This is where things get really powerful. Because then the veils start falling away. I don't know a better way to phrase this. Because then the veils start falling away. We go through our lives pretty much not noticing the deeper levels of things. And probably that's a good thing. I mean, if I was driving down the street, mostly paying attention to the empty nature, or the emptiness nature, or the devoid nature of my own consciousness, I might be a real hazard on the road. I might miss the light that turned red. I might miss the animal that's running out in the street in front of me, right? So this is something you don't necessarily want to be doing in everyday life, but you can do it on the meditation cushion and then become more familiar with what you really are. Now, again, what happens in meditation has an impact on what happens after meditation, right? So this is important to remember. It's not like these are two utterly separate realities, but they impact each other. And the emptiness nature of the world, which you can penetrate to in greater depth when you're sitting on the meditation cushion, is something that you can be aware of off the meditation cushion. You can be aware of the fact that I can be aware of the fact when I'm driving down the road that the road is a mental construction and still stay on the road safely. And I can be aware of the fact that I'm aware of the road and still stay on the road safely, and so on and so forth. I can't do it in the same way as I do it on the meditation cushion, but it does change the way I relate to what's going on in the world. And that's the important part, because we live in two realities. I mean, analytically, Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists talk about relative reality or conventional reality and ultimate reality. Conventional reality or relative reality is the world that we live in. That doesn't negate the reality of ultimate reality. They're two sides of the same coin. You know, everything that we're dealing with moment by moment has an emptiness nature. And we can be more or less aware of it depending upon how well we practice on the meditation cushion. And I find that it's very valuable to be aware of that emptiness nature of the world that I'm living in. It's dynamic, changing, transforming, interrelated process, right? Which I understand better when I'm on the meditation cushion. Okay, and I understand it particularly well, and I guess I would say the afterglow of doing a deep meditation on the emptiness nature of my own consciousness. What happens when you do that? Well, I can only share my own experience. I mean, you can read texts that talk about the advanced ways in which great meditators, have gotten into this quality of meditation on their own consciousness. And I think it's useful to know what the possibilities are in the direction that we might want to go. But I'm not a great meditator. I think most of us have to acknowledge our own limitations, right? But a lot can still be accomplished, and that's what I'm encouraging. So here's what my experience is. I'll share it with you. When I contemplate or meditate on the nature of my own consciousness, it immediately appears to be solid and unchanging. And yet I know that it's constantly transforming over time. And if I watch it closely, and I watched how it links up with other phenomena, sounds, images, thoughts, I can see how it changes over time. Perhaps more interestingly, though, I can also watch it go through changes as it becomes subtler and subtler and subtler. Now, if you remember, and now we're kind of sliding into a tantric or a Vajrayana way of thinking about the mind. If you've been attending some of these classes that I've been doing, or lectures that I've been doing, or talks I've been doing, whatever they are, I have talked about the tantric way of viewing the nature of mind, and that it exists in levels, coarse levels, subtle level, subtlest level. Okay. Coarse level is everyday consciousness. Subtle level is something we experience in dream. Subtlest level is something we experience when we're asleep but not dreaming. But if you sit in meditation long enough, looking at the empty nature of your own consciousness, everything in your body mind slows down. Your breathing slows down, the thought processes slow down, and they change. And in my experience, one of the things that changes is the sort of, what would I say? The rational chatter that's going on, the linguistic strings that hang together, the sentences that unfold in my consciousness, the word sentences that unfold in my consciousness, they begin to shift and they become much more metaphoric and much more imagistic. What's happening? What's happening is I'm slipping into more of a dream type consciousness. Now, we're all dreaming all the time in our own way, actually, even when we're wide awake. We do talk about daydreaming, but even when we're thinking, driving down the street, whatever it is, There are all kinds of imagination images and things that are going on in our own minds. We don't tend to recognize them as such. But when you sit long enough and slow down enough by paying close attention to the emptiness nature of your own consciousness, you start slipping into something that's subtler, which is much more like a dream state of consciousness. Now, it's not like the coarse consciousness disappears, at least for me, but that subtler dreaming kind of consciousness begins to manifest. Now, that's particularly valuable if you're doing deity yoga meditation, because then the deity, White Tara, Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Yamantaka, Guya Samaj, or whatever it is, comes more alive. It's not just something that you've manufactured. Well, you start out by manufacturing it, manufacturing the image. But as you slip more into the dream state of consciousness, the image comes alive, becomes lively in a certain way. And that's very powerful. Now, again, in my own experience, one of the things that happens as I'm moving in that direction is there's another dynamic that's going on that's also shifting. Remember in the tantric teachings, it said, well, not in the tantric teachings, just generally in the Buddhist teachings, it said that consciousness exists in relationship to what are called winds. These are the inner energies, if you will. And that consciousness is like a rider on the horse of the winds. The winds carry it from one place to another. They're not really separable by some ways of thinking. They're two, consciousness and wind are two aspects of the same thing. As this process goes forward, the winds begin to change. Now, in highest yoga tantra, they say what you want to try and do is you want to gather the winds into the central channel of the spine. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because I talked about it in other talks. When you get into this subtler state that comes from meditating on the nature of mind, right, the winds begin to gather in the central channel. Why does that matter? Well, for one thing, it generates some bliss. But for another thing, it concentrates the mind. And this is the great power that's useful. Because remember I said earlier, my mind is very distracted. Well, I guess maybe I'm a typical American that way. My mind is like the monkey mind, is jumping all over the place. But when the winds begin to gather in the central channel, and they do, the mind gets concentrated, the attention gets concentrated, and I can focus it. I can focus it on the empty nature of the winds, very powerful. I can focus it on the empty nature of the consciousness that's associated with the winds, very powerful. Things begin to fall away. And as I exist within this almost dreamlike state, and in my case, it's because I'm practicing deity yoga. I'm imagining myself as a deity, whatever deity you may be practicing with. And the deity has come to life. You meditate on the empty nature of the deity because it's another thought, it's another image. And you meditate on the empty nature of the consciousness in relationship to it, in the Chittamatra sense of subject and object being non-differentiated, right? And then the winds get even more powerful. The mind gets even more concentrated. And the structures, the forms of reality that the mind has created begin to turn hollow. And this is a very interesting experience. They begin to turn hollow. And what do I mean by that? Many years ago, when I was beginning the study of the doctrine of emptiness, at that time, I read a lot by the Buddhist scholar Edward Kanza, now deceased for a very long time, great translator of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And he etymologized the word shunyata to the original Sanskrit. And he said it's related to the term for a gourd. A gourd. Spa, I think he said it was. I'm not sure about that though. But this part I do remember. Why a gourd? Well, if you think about a gourd is empty on the inside and it has a form on the outside. It's hollow. Things that are empty are actually hollow in the sense that what we put on them or stuck in them is not actually there. And when we withdraw the projection, what's left? The hollow appearance. Now, that's a very interesting experience when appearances go hollow because you recognize the emptiness of them, right? It's said that in the post-meditative session, you recognize that the world is illusion-like. And this is very important to understand, illusion-like. Many Indian schools of philosophy say the world is an illusion. It's a dream. But the Buddhists say it's dream-like because it's hollow. It's dream-like. There's a book that Jeffrey Hopkins translated. I think it was actually the Wheel of Existence. I'm not sure about this. But in the preface, Jeffrey doesn't usually talk about his own experience. But when he wrote the preface to this particular book, and I'm not sure that it was the Wheel of Existence, he talked about working with the Dalai Lama, doing the translating work. You know, what an extraordinary experience that was, and how it began to affect him. And he'd be working with His Holiness, they'd be doing this translating, and then he would leave and he'd go out into Dharamsala someplace, and everything would seem different to him because of that. Excuse me. He said that one day when he was leaving the room where the two of them were translating together, and His Holiness, this is my experience, His Holiness looks straight into you, and he knows what's going on inside of you. And as a great teacher, he'll tell you what you need to know, but you don't know you need to know. But he knows you need to know from looking deeply inside of you. As Jeffrey was leaving this room, he got to the door, and His Holiness said, fairly quietly apparently, "It's like a dream." And Jeffrey stopped and looked at him. And His Holiness said much more loudly, "It's like a dream." And then Jeffrey went about his business, and he said everything looked really different to him after that. It's hollow. It's like a dream, but it's there. It may be like a dream, but it's there, and we have to deal with it. All right? We're not sitting in a cave someplace. We have to deal with it, and we have to make the best of it. And better than that, we can downright enjoy it. Or, as Aida said in our last get together, and as I rephrased it, you can turn your existence into art. Basically, everything that you do can be an artful expression of living in the world, because it is hollow, because it is dreamlike, and because it is created in its own way by your own mind. You can make it different Now, I'm not saying that I do this on a regular basis. I'd be a saint if I could do this on a regular basis. And believe me, I'm far from being a saint. But you can notice this stuff and you can do your best. And things do change. So back to the meditation cushion. So that's post-meditative session. Back to the meditative session. You're sitting on the meditative cushion and everything begins to turn hollow, empty. The form is there, but it's emptied of, I don't know how to express to you what it's emptied of, but it's emptied. So what next? Well, this process can go on and on and on and on. And the Buddhist meditation manuals talk about many stages of the on and on and on and on. I'm not going to try and talk about them tonight. There's a very simple reason for that. I haven't gotten very far into those on and on and on stages. The world turning hollow is pretty far. But as the winds gather and the mind concentrates and the bliss increases, things get subtler and subtler. Ultimately, where they lead to is the clear light mind. And if you remember earlier on, I was talking about this story of my meeting with Lama Rinpoche, who said, there is a subtle mind that goes from life to life. And I said at the time, I had no idea what he meant because I hadn't studied or practiced anything within the Tantra, within the Vajrayana. But this process that I'm talking about of constantly emptying the consciousness of its appearances and the false ideas that are associated with it, ultimately, on the power of the gathered winds, takes one to that experience. That I do know. And I've touched that just a couple times in my life, so I can certify that that's true. I think I've touched it. Maybe that's self-delusion. But anyhow, the texts definitely say that that's where it goes. Why would it be important to get at it? Well, Lama Rinpoche said this to me as a way of resolving my nihilistic extreme of existence at that time. But getting at it does two things. It removes both the absolutistic and the nihilistic. The absolutistic of everything is just what appears. And what appears is that my body is going to die and that's the end of me, which is, by the way, also the nihilistic wrapped up together, right? It removes those extremes, right? And it shows us the reality of what we truly are rather than what we appear to be, which is to say that we are a body-mind wrapped around the clear light mind. And when the body-mind falls away, as it will for all of us, the clear light mind will go on. Now, having said that, it's easy to think, well, oh, okay, that sounds pretty absolutistic, but it's not. Right? The clear light mind is of an empty nature. What we think it is not what it is. If we assume that it is a solid something that goes from life to life like an Atman, that's not what it is. Okay. We can't say what it is. Even when we experience it, we can't say what it is because it's beyond the ability of the rational mind to embrace. The rational mind doesn't go there, but we can go there. And that is the point. If we're Vajrayana practitioners, that's the point of every single thing that we do, is to have that experience which certifies the reality that we exist in that we both mostly just don't even know that we exist in. But it's there in every one of us at every moment, the background, the context, the framework in which every bit of us exists. And as I say in Zen, just as the hand can't grasp itself, so our conventional mind can't grasp it. That doesn't mean it's not there. It's there. Okay. I don't have anything else to say about Shunyata. I'm sure some other people would have other things to say, but I'm just trying to speak from my own experience. You can read lots of books that go beyond my experience, and I recommend them. So if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take them. And I see something that's just popped in. Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. You were bringing someone else up.
No, that's okay. I just got a bravo compliment from Jeffrey. I guess he liked my discourse. But what is your question, Tony?
It really isn't a question, but it is something that relates, that I think relates very much to what this entire class has been about.
Okay.
It relates to me. And today, I just finished a verse. It's 7-line stanza about my own personal experience on the cushion. It's about 70 seconds long. Would it be okay if I read it?
Of course.
Okay. Its title is A Glimpse. No way to explain. Sitting silently, the light turned around, looking within. No thing found. Not holding on, not letting go. Non-dual and free. Simultaneously, samsara and nirvana self-liberate, interpenetrate, and liberate each other. Not empty, not full. Non-dual and free. Samsara and nirvana have different names, but are identical in the realm of reality. Luminous, deep, beyond hidden and seen. Inconceivable. No way to explain.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, oh my God. Wow. Wow. That took me 7 years to write. I'm serious. It started in 2014, ended in 2016, and it's taken 7 years to write 7 lines. and I suck as a writer. This is the best I could do. But I'm glad you like it. It means a lot to me.
Oh, it's more than liked it. It seems to me like you've encapsulated pretty much everything that I've been talking about in 7 really beautiful, concise lines. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it's an amazing experience. Thank you.
Yeah, it is an amazing experience. This is the Buddha Dhamma. This is what it did for me to this moment in time. I'm 78. I don't have a lot of time left, but whatever's left is devoted to the Buddha Dhamma.
Yeah, I understand.
Devotion.
Yeah.
And nothing short of that.
What a great way to end the class. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the class. Thank everybody for being here, because this class would be impossible if any one of us was left out.
Well, that's true. That is true.